I'm not talking about specific institutions. I'm talking about individuals. And I should be very clear about that. When we investigate individuals and their activities. They may be individuals and their activities, and they may be associated with a particular institution, but it's the individuals that we investigate. So, for instance, we don't investigate mosques.
Tonight's top story, the lone wolf. It's a term we hear often from politicians, law enforcement, even the media. I've used it myself. The terrorist attacks in Ottawa, St. Jean, done by so-called lone wolves. The hatchet attack in New York was the act of a lone wolf, and according to New York Police Commissioner, well, there's nothing we know at this time that would indicate that Islamic terrorism is the case. It's a similar story for the attacks in Oklahoma, Fort Hood. So what does the term lone wolf really mean, and why are officials so reluctant to use the word terrorism? What is this all about? Contributing editor for National Review, Andy McCarthy, joins us now from New York. Mr. McCarthy, until I read your piece, I hadn't thought about the lone wolf as being a term we shouldn't use. I was talking with Steve Emerson last week using it in saying, look, Steve, I think the days of busting up plots is over. We're going to see more lone wolf attacks. I was using it as a very dangerous guy on its own. You say the way it's used by most people, it means something else. Explain.
Well, yeah, Brian, it's actually something that comes out of surveillance law. And interestingly, it's a term that in its current usage, which is by government officials to suggest non-terrorism, that it's just the individual, not a terrorist organization. The original genesis of the term was meant to suggest precisely the opposite. It was a situation in surveillance law where you have to be able to show, or used to have to be able to show, that there was a foreign power or a terrorist organization involved. And that left us with a surveillance gap, because if you developed evidence that a guy was preparing for terrorism, but you hadn't yet developed evidence that connected him to an actual organization, you wouldn't be able to get national security wiretapping authority. So to fix that after 9/11, they came up with this lone wolf provision, which actually means that if someone's preparing for terrorism, you should assume that he is a terrorist, and the court can therefore eavesdrop on him or authorize agents to eavesdrop on him, even if they haven't yet developed evidence that someone like Al-Qaeda is involved.
But now what you're saying is whether it's Thompson in New York with the hatchet attack, or Zayaf Bibo in Ottawa, Ahmed Rouleau in St. Jean, that when they say, oh, this is a lone wolf, that's meant to say, don't worry, no terrorism to see here. That's the underlying message, you think?
Exactly right. And it's a problem really that goes back a quarter of a century. In the case that I prosecuted in the mid-1990s, we had a defendant called El Said Nosair, who committed one of the more notorious homicides in the modern history of New York, killing Meir Kahane, the founder of the Jewish Defense League, in front of about 100 people at a hotel. And the day after the homicide, even as we were taking boxes and boxes of jihadist materials out of this guy's home, the chief of detectives in the New York City Police Department got up before any competent investigation could have been done and said, lone wolf, just the act of a lone deranged gunman, no terrorism organization here, no Islamic terrorism in particular.
So we got about a minute left. Let me ask you then, what do we do? What do we call this? Because I do think we're going to have more of these guys acting alone, but inspired by ISIS, inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. So what do you call them?
Yeah, well, you call it terrorism because just the fact that they are acting alone, if they are, and by the way, what's called lone wolf terrorism in the moment, usually when we do the investigation, we do find connections to these organizational elements. But the fact of the matter is they're not acting in a vacuum, and they're not self-radicalized. They're actually inspired by a particular doctrine, and the doctrine may be mediated by a terrorist organization, a fiery imam, but it may also be by the information that's easily disseminated. But it's the ideology that causes it.
All right, Andy McCarthy in New York, thanks so much for your insight, sir.